Okay, so Katharine Napora is an environmental archaeologist specializing in climate change and coastal societies in the ancient past. Her work combines information from tree rings, shell middens, radiocarbon dating and modeling, and chemical analyses to better understand how people experienced and interacted with their environment. She has worked in Georgia, Florida, Ireland, Switzerland, Greece, and the Southwest United States. Katharine is particularly interested in advancing archaeological science methodologies, developing collaborative interdisciplinary projects, and using information about the ancient past to improve sustainability, resilience, and social justice in the 21st century. And we're really excited to have you. I'll stop sharing my screen and you can take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Let me get my screen sharing here. Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, sorry. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you today. So I'll be talking about 5 millennia of environmental changes in the coastal Southeast that we can see through tree ring analyses that I and my colleagues have conducted, as well as new research trajectories that we're embarking upon. So first, I'll be talking a little bit about the basics of dendrochronology, which is the science of tree rings. And then we'll delve into what environmental aspects we can get at on the Southeast coast from these tree ring analyses. And then we'll talk about these new research trajectories that are coming up. So first of all, the basics, important things to understand. How do trees grow? So usually in temperate environments, trees grow 1 ring every year. That's not always the case, but in general, that's true. And that 1 ring consists of 2 parts, which are called the early wood and the late wood. So we can kind of imagine tree growth as cones, like traffic cones, stacked on top of one another. In this little diagram we see in the middle of the page here, this diagram was made in 1968, which is the most recent ring of growth of this tree. So we can see here's the year for 1964, like a little cone, 1965 piled on top of it, 66, and so on. So you can see that anywhere in the tree, say if you cut it down or if you take a little sample that doesn't hurt the tree, anywhere is going to have the most recent ring of growth in it, that year of 1968, because it's overlaid over everything. But for instance, if you sample up here, you might not get those earlier years of growth. So yeah, just think of a tree as little tiny cones, elongated cones, all stacked on top of one another. Trees grow really fast in the spring when they start growing for the year, and then they have a slower growth in the fall, in the late summer and early fall. And that manifests as, for instance, in this pine tree in the photo in the upper right here, 1 ring is from the beginning of this light part to the end of this dark part. So that's 1 year of growth in this pine tree. This is the early wood, this light portion, and here's the late wood. So the tree's growing really, really fast in the spring when it starts, and then the growth slows down, and it's this denser, darker band that marks the end of that annual ring. And then trees are dormant in the winter. So the next spring, the tree starts growing again. So here's the beginning of the next ring of, or the next year of growth. So from here to here and so on. The width of that annual tree ring is largely determined by environmental factors. And there's often one major environmental factor called the limiting factor that's driving the width of that annual tree ring. And in many places in the world, that's either precipitation, rainfall, or temperature. So a thin ring is going to indicate either it's a dry year or it's a really cold year. And a thick ring, by comparison, is going to mean that it's a really rainy year or a really warm year. So in areas like Florida and the Southeast U.S., it's actually rainfall that's the major limiting factor there. So a thin ring will correspond to a dry year and a thick ring to a wet year. There's a really important concept in dendrochronology that's called cross-dating. So that is basically matching up the patterns of tree rings. Since there's this major environmental driver that's determining the width of all the tree rings in a given area, those patterns of tree rings, thick and thin, are going to match between trees. So to create what's called a tree ring chronology, which is a standardized representation of annual tree growth from a site, or in some areas of the world, even a larger region, we start with a modern tree. So this famous little diagram here is from the University of Arizona's Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. And what it's showing is this pattern of cross-dating. So we're starting here with this modern living tree, modern being the year, what was this, 31, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1939, which is when this little diagram was made. So in 1939, somebody went out and they took a core of this living tree. They've counted backwards here. So here's 1939, 38, 37, 36, 35, and so on. The individual decades are marked with a little dot here. So here's 1930, 10 more years back is 1920, 10 more is 1910, and so on. So if we only had this modern tree, we'd only be able to get back a few decades. But with finding older and older samples of wood, we're able to push this pattern back farther and farther into the past. So we can tell from the modern, whoops. All right, it seems to be playing by itself. We can tell from the modern tree here that the year 1930 in the Southwest U.S. was a really dry year. It's this really thin little ring that's marked here. This pattern of rings, thick and thin, is going to match between this living tree and the pattern from an old stump in the woods. So if we just had the old stump in the woods, we don't know what years it's representing because it's no longer living. But by matching that pattern, here's its pattern, to the living tree pattern, you can see where those overlap. Here's a bunch of really thin rings indicating really dry years in the 1910s. And so now the pattern has been pushed back farther into the past. Now archaeological wood has been found, for instance, from this Pueblo's what are called vigas, these construction beams on the Pueblo. And here's the pattern from that Pueblo site. And so these patterns can be pushed farther and farther back into the past. It just depends on being able to find ancient wood. And in some cases, that can be really difficult. We were really fortunate in the Southeast U.S., which is not known for its dendrochronology, for its tree ring analyses, because unlike places in the world where wood can be buried in bogs and preserved there, or it can be buried in, for instance, alpine lakes. Sorry if I see my internet connection says it's unstable. I hope it's working for everybody. Jamie, let me know if it's breaking up or anything. So we were really fortunate, though, in the Southeast U.S. to be able to find a deposit of ancient wood. For my dissertation work at the University of Georgia, I went out with colleagues and found a bunch of ancient trees that were buried on these islands, Butler Island and Champney Island, in the Altamaha Wildlife Management Area, which is here right at the mouth of the Altamaha River. And we also obtained modern trees from Sapelo Island right over here, which is the closest modern forest we were able to find. So with my colleagues in the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, I went out and hiked around these islands at the mouth of the Altamaha River, and we collected 123 cookies, which are slices through the trunks of these trees, these ancient trees. These have been buried down in the mud on the Georgia coast for thousands of years. And you can see me sitting on top of one of them here. These are dug up during maintenance work at the Altamaha Wildlife Management Area. And so that's how they've come up to the surface now when roads are being maintained after heavy, sorry, something weird is going on here. When roads are being maintained at the Altamaha Wildlife Management Area, these ancient trees are dug up, and we have to get out there pretty fast to be able to get samples of them. And so we were really fortunate that we found 123 ancient trees that we got samples of. These are all bald cypress trees. So they're an extremely long-lived species. You guys have them down in Florida as well. And they can actually reach an age of 3,500 years at least, we know. So this is a wonderful species to be able to look at the ancient environment. There's been a series of studies all up and down the East Coast and down into Mexico by a researcher at the University of Arkansas, Dave Staley, who's used this species of tree. But finding these ancient trees to be able to look farther back into the ancient past hasn't happened before this. So we found all these ancient trees. There's no way to know how old they are just looking at them. So we radiocarbon dated every one of these trees. And in a really cool little side story, these exact trees we looked at are actually the same trees that gave the idea that sea level has fluctuated through time. Charles Lyell, who's the father of geology, he's known as, came and visited this island in 1850. And as he says in this little quote, we saw the buried stumps of the cypress maintaining the upright position in which they originally grew. Trees once flourished where they would now be immediately killed by the salt water. There must have been a change in the relative level of land and sea to account for their growth. And so these trees we were looking at, which we're using to look at sea level change in the ancient past and other environmental factors, are actually the exact same trees that first gave rise to this idea. So based on these trees and the patterns of their rings, I was able to construct a very long tree ring chronology, which spans 5,177 years from 3161 BCE to 2016 CE. And that's because 2016 is the most recent year in which I went out and got the samples from the modern living trees. So this chronology extends very far back into the ancient past. It's the longest one on the East Coast here. And so on this little graph that we're looking at, these are what are called the tree ring indices that are this dark gray line fluctuating back and forth. So you can see numbers over on the left here. 1,000 means that that's an average tree ring. Lines that are above 1,000 mean that that year was bigger than normal. So that's a wet year. Lines that are smaller than 1,000 down here mean that that year was smaller than average. So in some cases, there's some really small rings that we can see emerging from this pattern. And we also were able to construct an earlier chronology that's called a floating chronology, because there's a gap between this chronology that's anchored to the present and the floating chronology. But the floating chronology extends our ability to look into the ancient past by several hundred more years as well. So when we compare this tree ring chronology to known precipitation, salinity, and hurricanes, we see several patterns coming out that tell us what this chronology is showing us. So in this area of the country, we know already that precipitation is the main driver of ring width. However, in coastal areas, there's not as strong of a connection to precipitation, and that's the case here. So we see January through May precipitation is the strongest correlate to this chronology. So that's mostly what this chronology is showing us, is how much rain was there in January through May. It's also showing us a little bit about salinity in May through September. And then we also see some indicators of hurricanes too. In 48% of the recorded hurricanes that hit the Georgia coast or impacted it between the years 1750 and 2012, in about half of those cases, we see a really big year, a really big ring when that hurricane hits, and then the next year is a really tiny little ring. And we think that that may be because hurricanes come with a lot of rainfall that's increasing that late wood, making the tree grow a thick ring that year. But then there may be lingering storm surge or lingering salinity that's staying in those coastal forests, and that's impacting the trees negatively for the next year. So they're showing a really small ring. So while we can't definitively identify hurricanes from this pattern, it gives us some idea of where to maybe look. And there are some other ways that we might be able to identify hurricanes that hit the Southeast coast in the ancient past that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So I figured out that we might be able to look at other aspects of the ancient environment by doing chemical analyses of these ancient trees too. One thing I and my colleagues were really interested in is sea level change in the ancient past and how it might have impacted human societies. And so we found a study, several studies actually from the 1990s, that indicated that when bald cypress trees are flooded with high levels of salinity, sort of replicating either rising sea level or storm surge from hurricanes, they take up salts, sodium chloride and bromide, into their outer rings. And so the longer the tree is able to survive in those really salty conditions, the farther back into the wood those salts actually penetrate. So based on that study, which was done on modern bald cypress saplings, so they flooded these young trees with different levels of salts, and then they recorded what chemicals and what elements were in their tree rings. We hypothesized that we could look at the elemental analyses of these ancient trees rings, which would tell us about salinity-induced mortality. So in the modern study of trees, Yanowski and colleagues, they found that if the tree can survive a salinity intrusion event, say a storm pushes salty water into the forest, the tree is uptaking these salts that are really bad for it, and it can't survive for very long. But then the storm surge retreats and it becomes normal levels of low salinity again. That tree might be able to survive an event like that. And if that's the case, it's going to push those salts out of its wood. So we won't see any salts in the wood unless the tree actually died in that salinity intrusion event. So this will be, if we find the salts, we say that, okay, we're going to say that this tree actually died of salinity-induced mortality. And then the farther back into the wood we find those salts, we can say that, okay, we know that this tree was able to survive relatively longer in salty conditions, which probably means that salt is increasing at a slower level than it would if the tree was killed really fast. So based on those, we decided to conduct some analyses. We used inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectroscopy, or ICP-OES, at the University of Georgia Center for Applied Isotope Studies. And so we looked at all of the trees that grew before 1000 BCE, because that was the period I was focused on for my analysis of late archaic archaeological sites. And so we looked at all the trees that had their outer rings present. So if we look at this tree cookie on the left, it's like a quarter cookie of a tree, right? Because it would extend out here. But you can see this dividing line here between what looks kind of like a little bit orangier color on the outside, and then this cooler sort of toned color on the inside. This is the boundary between what's called the sapwood on the outside and the heartwood on the inside. So the sapwood is the only part of a tree that's actually alive. It's the part that's still transmitting nutrients up and down the tree. And it has a lot more potential to rot away. So we were able to find this, though, on most of the trees we looked at, because they were buried in such great preservation conditions. And if we didn't have the sapwood, we know that we didn't have the outer years of life of that tree. So this analysis might not be so good. So we used only trees for which we did have the outer rings or the sapwood intact. So we know that this analysis is actually capturing what salty conditions were like in the last years of these trees' lives. So for 33 trees that grew before 1000 BCE, we took 3 samples per tree. So one at the outside, one a little bit in, and one farther in. And we ran a total of 99 ICP-OES samples from that. And our results are really cool. So we weren't able to detect 2 of those salts, chloride and bromide, but we were able to detect sodium. And so in 21 of the 33 trees, at least one of those 3 tests had high levels of sodium in it. And those levels of sodium, which indicate that that tree died of salinity intrusion, actually cluster in some cases, which is really cool. So if we look at this graph down here at the bottom, this is the same tree ring chronology we saw earlier. It's just zoomed in, so we're only looking at the period before 700 BCE. So this is 3161 BCE to 700 BCE. All of these little black dots is the year in which a tree died with salt in its outer rings. So these are trees that died of salinity intrusion events. And we can see there's 4 clusters highlighted in the yellow here. So here, and here. And this is when more than one tree dies in a really short period of time. In these 2 at the beginning, there's extremely high levels of sodium that we detected, which probably indicates that this is really rapidly increasing sodium levels in these two cases. And we also have three trees that die in each of these within about 75 years. So what are we looking at here? This could be a storm surge from increased hurricane frequency, or it could be sea level transgression. So with this analysis, we can't really distinguish between those two, but we're hoping to do some oxygen isotopes in the future. We'll start that in the spring, which will help us figure out, are these hurricanes that killed these trees, or is this rapidly rising sea level? So now let's take a look at those 4 clusters of tree deaths from high salinity levels and compare that to existing sea level curves for the Southeast U.S. And this is also really cool. So here are those 4 clusters in the yellow here. And each of these colors on this graph is a different model of sea level. So we can see here that this is that first cluster of deaths. On none of these instances of sea level models does this seem to indicate a rise. However, this is so close to number 2 here that this actually may be a separate event that other proxy environmental proxies cannot detect. And indeed, there's evidence that on the Gulf Coast, down where you guys are, there was a sea level low stand from around 2800 to 2600 BCE. And this is the best documented sea level low stand in the Southeast U.S. There's a lot of lines of proxy evidence from this study that indicate that this really happened. And so if this is the case also on the Atlantic coast, number 1 here would hit that exactly. So it's very likely that this first cluster of trees that die are killed by rapidly rising sea levels. And then 2 and 3 here, they correlate really well with this green model that we see. So right here, sea level starts to rise on this green sea level model. That's when we see another cluster of tree deaths. And here's when we see another cluster of tree deaths right at those spots. So it's possible that those are sea level. It's also possible that number 3 is in fact increased storm frequency, because we do see that down in the Gulf of Mexico as well. But so a lot of people think that there wasn't actually as much sea level fluctuation as some of these more wiggly models are indicating. What they might have been detecting is that increased storm frequency. So right now we're leaning towards this one is showing us that there's more storm frequency right at this period. And then finally with number 4 here, all of these models of sea level indicate that there was a sea level low stand happening. And so our data shows that it's very likely that that sea level low stand and the subsequent rapid rise in sea level actually happened about 100 years earlier than previous models suggest. So that's really cool too, that with these tree rings, which are the annual source of data, and there's nothing else in environmental proxies that allows us to get it not just an actual year, but an actual season because of that early wood and that late wood. And so this shows us that we can really get it more precise models of sea level change in the ancient past from these tree rings than we can with other types of proxies. And so now let's take a look at the years that these trees span. So on this graph, we're going again from 3161 BCE up until the present day. And each of these little lines, these little gray lines, is the lifespan of one tree. So there's 123 of them in total. And we can see here 2 interesting things. One of these is that there's this 355-year gap in which no trees start growing right at the beginning of the chronology. And then the other really interesting thing is that you can see this dramatic lifespan decrease that happens right around 530 CE. So those are 2 things that are really highly visible in this, this graph of tree lifespans that we're looking at here. So now let's look into what all of this shows us over 5,000 years. What environmental insights can we glean from this chronology? So one thing is this gap with no tree establishment. This may mean that there was inundation happening, that it was a really wet period. That is what we see today when there are no new bald cypress trees that start growing. A lot of the times that's a really wet period with a whole bunch of rain when the ground is totally saturated. And that's because these bald cypress seedlings, they're not able to grow in very wide conditions. They have to have like kind of moist soil, not too dry, not too wet, like a Goldilocks zone. And so that may be what we're looking at here. We'll have to get some other measures, some other types of data to prove this, but this is like an interesting gap here. Then we see these two rapid salinity intrusion events that happen, followed by possible environmental fluctuation. So this is still environmental fluctuation, which we're getting at by looking at the variance in that tree ring chronology. How different is it from year to year? That's still a little bit hard to say, because even though we have 123 trees, we don't have tons of trees covering each single year. And so that's something that we're going to have to do in the future, is find more trees out at that Altamaha Wildlife Management Area so we can have a greater depth of replication, so we can figure out if this stuff is real, because this environmental fluctuation may be more based just on the fact that we have less trees from that time period. So we're not positive about that right now. We also see, for instance, on the Florida Gulf Coast, right at this time period when there is a major salinity intrusion event that we see in the trees, there's this enhanced catastrophic storm frequency. So that's always really good when we see multiple lines of evidence coming together. That's what we want in any kind of science, is multiple things that support one another. And then down here at the end, there's this mid to late Holocene climate change event around 1000 BCE. And during that, we also see a period of this likely environmental fluctuation and a rapid salinity intrusion event. So that's the years BCE that we're looking at. Now let's look at CE. So just around 530 CE is when those tree lifespans decrease. This is really notable, and it's going to be the first publication that comes out of this. Because this also matches right when the Vandal minimum starts up. This is this major period of environmental downturn that happens really all around the world. A lot of work has been done in this in Florida. So we see drier summers and colder winters happening in Florida. And if the environment is not as stable, it's probably going to kill off these trees with a lot more frequency than it would have in a more stable environmental period. So the fact that this lifespan decrease from a lifespan of around, I believe it's like 600 years, to a lifespan of about like less than 200, which is pretty dramatic, that matches exactly with the onset of this Vandal minimum and with the zooarchaeological evidence that we see down in Florida and a little bit in Georgia too. So around 1550 CE is when the last couple of long-lived trees die. These are the last ones that are surviving. And that's right when the Little Ice Age starts. There's also evidence that this Little Ice Age, another period of climatic upheaval that would have really disrupted human societies around the world. In the Gulf of Mexico, we see this multi-decadal to centennial climate upheavals and a lot of cooling happening too. So I don't think it's random that the last couple of trees that have managed to hang on and have pretty long lifespans, even after this period of major lifespan decrease, they can't hang on any longer when the Little Ice Age hits. So to strengthen this work, like I said, this is the fact that a lot of these lines of evidence match up almost perfectly with different environmental models. That's pretty significant. But the fact that we don't have tons of trees, ideally we would have like hundreds or maybe even thousands of trees from this site, which will probably require decades more work and a team of people to do that. So we are working on developing a project to continue this work and strengthen it. There's also 3 analyses that I'm participating in right now to lend verification to this work. So we can figure out more lines of evidence showing that this research is indeed correct. So let's take a look at those. The first of these, what we're going to do is in the spring is identify these radiocarbon spikes. So radiocarbon, which is produced by solar flares, basically flaring at different amounts through time, it has produced a few of these known events where there's a really big spike in radiocarbon in a single year that has been identified in tree rings. And so Miyake and colleagues have done a bunch of research on this. There's 3 of these events that happen in 774, 775, 992, 993, and then 660 BCE that overlap with this Georgia coast tree ring chronology. So you can see on this graph here, this is the amount of radiocarbon in every single year. And here is that year, 774, 775. So huge jump up here. This is something that's been identified in trees from around the world. So if we can identify this one and then these other 2 events, that'll lend good evidence. Since the tree ring patterns of trees living in coastal environments, they don't match up as well as trees living in more inland environments. And then also trees sort of growing in the Southeast U.S. in general tend not to have as strong of a match between trees as some other areas do. That in addition to the fact that we weren't able to get totally perfect samples in a lot of cases here. We just had to take what was available. And a lot of the time that was the lower part of these big bald cypress trees. And if you guys have seen bald cypress trees, they flare out at the bottom. That's not the best place to do dendrochronology, but in a lot of cases, that's all we had to work with. So if we can identify these events in the tree rings, this will give another really good line of evidence that we're on the right track here. The second thing we're doing is looking at those oxygen isotopes to identify hurricanes. So when water from the ocean is taken up into the clouds, taken up into a hurricane, there are several different isotopes of oxygen. There's 16 and 18 that we're looking at. So those have different numbers of neutrons in them. So oxygen 18 is heavier because it has 18 neutrons than oxygen 16 is. It's harder to lift up a heavier thing. So more of that lighter isotope is already brought up into the clouds. And then when that hurricane starts swirling and it starts producing rainfall, more of that heavy oxygen is going to start raining out too, because it's harder to keep that up in the air. So the more the hurricane swirls around and produces rainfall, the lighter and lighter the oxygen isotopic signature becomes. And we can actually identify that in tree rings. Some studies of living pine trees down in southern Georgia that separated the early wood. And if you remember that picture that's again on the upper right here, that they're separating the light part. So that's the spring growth from the late summer and early fall growth. And that's when the hurricanes hit, right? Is late summer and fall. And so we want to isolate the chemical signature that's in that part of the tree that was laid down during that time period. And so this has been shown that we can actually identify hurricanes through this. So in the spring, we're going to start on a study to see if we can identify known hurricanes in these coastal trees. And if that works, we can push this back farther and farther into the ancient past and actually have a record of what years hurricanes hit the Southeast coast over the last 5,000 years, which would be something that's never been produced over such a long time scale before anywhere in the world. This is another cool project that I'm really excited about doing. We're just developing this, but we're planning to do genetic analysis of these ancient trees. So this would help us to figure out, are there differences between the trees that had long lifespans and these trees that had much shorter lifespans? I'm especially interested in figuring out what's going on here with this around 530 CE. Is there some kind of a genetic bottleneck where most trees are killed off and only some that have genetics for shorter lifespans are surviving and reproducing? Or is there something else happening in that environment? And we're also interested in some trees lived through those salinity intrusion events that we see while those other ones died. And so are there genetic markers of salinity tolerance in trees? This would not only help us understand the ancient past better, but it would help us with conservation efforts today. This is a field called conservation paleobiology, which I'm really excited about. It's something that's this really burgeoning field that a group was only developed in 2019 for. So there's a bunch of researchers around the world, and we always say, okay, we're going to try to use what we're studying to improve the present. And it's like, how is that done though, you know? And so this field of conservation paleobiology, it actually asks us as researchers and scientists and other interested people, so descendant communities who were interested in participating in this kind of research, federal and state agencies. This is supposed to be collaborative work, figuring out how can we use information about the ancient past to improve conservation and sustainability today. So if we can identify genetic markers in these ancient trees of longevity and salinity tolerance, then we can try to identify that in modern bald cypress saplings too, so that in restoration efforts where saplings are planted to try to restore forests that are being killed by sea level rise, we can try to make sure that we're actually planting saplings that will do the best in those conditions. And so that's something that I think is a really exciting aspect of ancient archaeological and environmental work. Things that have direct relevance to helping us today and in the future. So I see that we're almost at the end here. I do have a few more slides after this about some other tree ring based archaeological work that myself and my colleagues are undertaking. But I think I'm going to end there for now. And then if we have any time at the end, we can discuss that other type of work too. So thank you all very much. I'm going to stop sharing this for now so I can pull up the chat box and see you all.
Well, thank you so much, Katharine. That was just really amazing work that you're doing. I was really excited to hear some of the results and just amazing. I love the conservation paleobiology aspect at the end, but really just for the archaeological data, it's just absolutely amazing. So thank you for sharing that with us. Everyone, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat. I will be happy to start us off though. I just have to look at my scrambled notes real quick.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned that I think the max lifespan of cypress is about 3,500 years.
Yes, that's right. So Dave Staley, the researcher at Arkansas who's conducted a whole lot of work on bald cypress, has actually found some living cypress that are that old today. So yeah, these are extremely long-lived trees. And we keep finding that they live longer and longer than we actually thought they did.
Wow. So what was the longest lived tree in your study?
We had one that was 1,078 years old.
Oh, wow. Okay, any questions? I guess I was also interested in the ICP-OES. Those are spots, right? Ablation spots?
So those are digested samples. So you're thinking of laser ablation,
right.
Which is another way to do that, which we're planning on doing that in the future. So ICP-OES is you cut out a little sample of whatever you're looking at, and that gets digested with acids and put into a machine. There's also a way to do this with lasers though, where you don't have to cut out a sample. The laser just automatically runs along your sample and it takes recordings of what elements it's seeing at different locations. There's another way to do this that's the SEM-EDS, which is what I'm currently working on. That's scanning electron microscopy, energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. And that is amazing. So that actually produces a map of your sample and a map of where all the elements are within it. And so that's something I've been looking forward to using for a long time because unlike just like a single line that the laser would produce, which is only like a few cells wide. So, you know, if there's something weird going on on in those few cells, you're not going to catch that. Whereas with SEM EDS, you get the mapping of your object. And so I think that would also help us to get a lot more precision on things like the salinity intrusion in the ancient past, because instead of just sort of like taking a chunk and another chunk and another chunk, we'd actually be able to say, okay, like the salt has penetrated in 15 rings from the outside. Like, what does that mean exactly? And we'd be able to compare that data. So we're currently using that on shells, actually, to look at heavy metal concentrations in freshwater shells from Green River, Kentucky archaeological context. And that has a conservation paleobiology goal too. So our goal with that is to try to help figure out how to improve conservation of these really endangered mussels today. They're impacted a lot by runoff of heavy metals from coal mining industries and from other pollutant types of things. And so if we can look back into the ancient past and figure out when these mussel populations were flourishing, what were heavy metal levels like, then we'll be able to figure out better standards today that we can share with state and federal agencies. So all of this kind of work, it really overlaps. It's the shells are very similar to trees. They have annual growth bands in a lot of cases that we can look at changes throughout their lives too. Yeah, so there's all these very cool technologies. And yeah, if anybody is interested in that, I'm very happy to speak more about that. I see somebody asks, what do the radiocarbon spikes data tell you about the environment the sample trees lived in? So that wouldn't tell us so much specifically about the environment as it would anchor the chronology in those years in time. So since the patterns of those rings, the matching between them is like relatively low, we need a little more data to prove that this is where the match is correct. And if we can see those exact spikes, we know for sure that that is the year 774, 775. So that's really an anchoring technique more than it is about exactly what happened in the environment in that year. So as far as we know, we don't think that majorly impacted the environment in those specific years. It does seem to have been recorded in some human societies. So I believe it's the 994 event was recorded in England as a red cross in the sky. And that's what people think that was actually this major solar flare that was interpreted as an omen by the people who were in that culture at that time. But so yeah, these spikes are another line of evidence that our data is telling us about the time period that we think it is.
Well, I'll revisit your previous answer with the mussels. I have used LAICP-MS and also LIBS, the laser induced breakdown spectroscopy. There's so many acronyms. But yes, so seeing the trace element maps is just so beneficial in shells, and I imagine trees as well, just to see where the variation lies spatially rather than just a single line transect. Have you looked at barium as a potential element of interest for looking at salinity intrusions?
No, we haven't. So I haven't ever done this with, we didn't see anything else strange in the data that we ran with the ICP OES for the trees. So I didn't notice that, but we should be able to see that in the mussels. Some elements, so all of these different techniques, they can't capture all the elements. That's another reason that sometimes you have to run like multiple techniques at the same time, is because some of them just aren't able to capture certain elements. So I believe with barium, the mapping, the SEM EDS can capture that. So that might be something. Is that something you're working on, Jamie?
No, I haven't actually used barium, but I've seen it in sclerochronology studies and on otoliths, comparing freshwater and saltwater intrusions. Mine was pretty focused on magnesium and strontium and your typical isotopes. But yeah, I was just throwing that out there to see if you had seen barium before.
I haven't looked at that. No, I think another one that would be interesting to look at is sulfur. That's also been shown in some salinity intrusion studies. We didn't really see that was under the detection level for the analysis we ran for the ICP-OES, but I think in the future that would be something that would be interesting to look at too. And there's so much work to do here that, you know, if anybody here has a person who's interested in studying this stuff in the future, there's like literally several lifetimes worth of research to be conducted out of all of these ancient trees and all of these other environmental proxies. And, you know, they help us understand both the ancient environment and of course what people were going through. And I didn't even really have time in this presentation to get into how this correlates with many different changes in culture, because, you know, getting the background on what we see with the environment like takes up the whole time here. But we do see, for instance, that in the late Archaic period, which is what I was focused in, people seem to have settled the big shell ring sites on the Georgia coast between two of those salinity intrusion events. And there's like two very distinct waves of settlement. And people actually live at those sites during a period of major environmental upheaval. But it looks like they might have left when a series of major hurricanes hits too. So that's also pretty interesting. And it's, you know, something to think about for the future is even if we can weather major periods of climatic upheaval, if something becomes too bad for too long, it might like drive societies to really have to change.
Absolutely. And there's a question to your point of getting involved in that kind of research. Do you know, like, how do you get involved in doing dendrochronology, either with you or with someone around? Because not a lot of people do it, right?
No, they don't, not in this area of the country. So it's a big thing out in the Southwest. The University of Arizona has the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, which is the biggest lab in the world. And then there's a whole bunch of this work done in Europe too. But here on the East Coast, there's not very much being done. And so, yeah, there's sort of only, there's a few people who are doing really cool research dating structures. So with dendrochronology, you can date the exact year that a tree was cut down to build a building. So this is sometimes used for dating historic buildings because of that availability of an exact year of cutting it down. But so, yeah, I would say that if somebody is interested in that, I would advise them, if they're a college student, to take classes in both anthropology and the geosciences. So any kind of background they can get on ancient environments or reconstructing environments is really beneficial. And then if they're looking to go maybe to grad school, the University of Arizona is really great. But I went to University of Georgia and I did a fellowship at Arizona, and I also did an internship in Switzerland at a tree ring lab. So there are opportunities, even if you're in a school that doesn't directly offer that type of research. I'd say that you know, just reach out to somebody who does this. Most people in the field are very welcoming and very happy to have young people interested in this kind of stuff. Or, you know, if it's somebody who's not in academia, if they're interested in also being involved, like this research could never have been done without my friends in the Georgia Department of Natural Resources who went and hiked around in the Altamaha Wildlife Management Area with me and trudged around through alligator infested waters and used a huge 4-foot chainsaw to cut samples. And so, you know, this is a collaborative work that takes the abilities of many people and combines them together. So I think that no matter what somebody is in, there's some kind of a place that they could become involved in this kind of research.
Awesome. And I guess kind of related, when you're looking at the cookies and actually counting and measuring these rings, are you doing that like physically doing it by hand, or are you using like imagery on a computer and doing it that way?
So this was a combination. There's a machine that's called a Velmex, which is the ideal thing to use in dendrochronology. So it has a little wooden stage, and I look through a microscope, and there's a little crosshair that I'm looking at in the microscope, and I turn a little wheel that moves the cookie sitting on the stage, and then every time I cross a new tree ring, I press a button, and it records how far the stage has moved. So it records the width of that annual tree ring. So that's the best way to do it. but some of these cookies were so big that I couldn't fit them under our Velmex. I had to like lean like 4 feet in, and that's not possible. So I took high resolution photos, and I used a program called ImageJ that was developed for measuring tree rings and fish otoliths and shells. So I used a combination of those two to do this chronology development work.
Awesome. Yeah, because I was thinking with like potential volunteer opportunities, if people download ImageJ and you send, high-res pictures of cookies, they could potentially like help in that way, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. That's a really good idea, actually, for dividing up this kind of work. And it's the kind of thing that could be like averaged across, the measurements that people got. Then we could like average out those measurements. That's a great idea for doing this kind of research. And because it's the kind of thing that, if you can imagine, I think I recorded, it was like over 40,000 tree rings that I measured for my project alone. And to give it more replication, which is, we need more trees at certain parts in the chronology, because ideally there'd be like 20 trees replicating each year, but that would take probably hundreds of trees. So we'd have to go get several hundred more. And that's a huge, time consuming effort, and it's going to require the multiple people teamed up to do that kind of work. So yeah, I think that this is a kind of project that's going to be ongoing, and different aspects of this are going to be continuing long into the future, I hope. So
yeah. Well, that's good. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Would you want to present your remaining few slides on?
Sure. If people would like to see that, I'm happy to show people who are still here. Yeah.
Sure.
Pull this up. Yeah, so I wanted to show some of this heritage science research that's tree ring based that the University of Georgia, Kentucky, Georgia Southern, and the National Park Service, we're all collaborating on this right now. And we're hoping to bring in other universities and other agencies too. So hopefully this will expand in the future. But of course, tree rings, we can get this exact date, like we said. And so combining that with what's called radiocarbon wiggle matching, we've been able to do some really cool work. This is a photo of some of these wooden canoes that are at Georgia Southern University that my colleagues and I worked on. This one here is from the Oconee River. So some guys who were out fishing saw this canoe and hauled it up, and it got brought over to Georgia Southern University. And so it's from the historic period. It's thought to be a Native American constructed canoe. And so I was brought in with Dr. Carla Haddon, who's the director of the Center for Applied Isotopes at University of Georgia, and our colleagues here at Georgia Southern University all worked on this project together. So what we were trying to do was to figure out, with a really high level of precision, what years are represented by the tree rings here. So one problem with this artifact, though, is the fact that it doesn't have any sapwood left on it. And if you remember, the sapwood is that part of the tree that's right on the outside, that's the living part of the tree, that's conducting nutrients. And so it's still like flooded with sugars, basically. And the fact that it has a bunch of sugars in it means that it decays a lot more. And so a lot of times when canoes are being constructed, the people making them remove that sapwood from the outside. So we don't actually have the outside rings of this tree. So all we could do with this is date it via a couple techniques, and estimate based on other trees how many more years might have been contained in this tree. So we could try to figure out about when this tree was cut down to make this canoe. So if we take, there are 354 rings that we counted in this tree. You can see it's like, this is a nice artifact to do this type of work with, because it's cut like nice and flat, and you can see these tree rings really well. This also works really well because in most cases, if you're looking at a wooden artifact, you have to either sand it down, or you have to take a core of it and sand that down. And for fragile artifacts like this, we can't do that with those. We're not going to sand down this beautiful canoe, or we're not going to take a core and possibly split it. So what this program of combined dendrochronological dating and what's called radiocarbon wiggle match dating, it helps us get around those limitations and use tree ring science for archaeology in some new ways. So if we just take a radiocarbon date from the outermost ring of this tree, we can see that it could be either from the 1600s or from the 1700s here, with a little bit of probability for other time periods. But this is a common issue with historic artifacts, because anything that's from these time periods, there's a lot of what are called wiggles in the radiocarbon curve. So that also means that there was a lot of solar flares happening at this time that created these sort of spikes that we see and all these wiggles going up and down. And so this doesn't help us too much in historic archaeology studies to say that, oh, well, it could be anywhere from the 1600s up until the 1900s, like a 300-year period. And we want to be a lot more precise than that. So one way we can get around this is through wiggle match dating, which takes a series of radiocarbon dates and actually uses computer modeling, statistical modeling, to tell the computer program that, okay, we know that there are 10 years in between this tree ring that was sampled and this tree ring that was sampled. And then we can input that into the model and get a much more precise date. So that's what we did with this tree here. What we did here is we took samples from every 10th ring in the tree, and then we ran the outermost and the innermost tree rings, and we decided that, okay, those fell right around this area. So we're going to see if we can hit this little wiggly bit of the radiocarbon calibration curve here. So we ran, what, 7 radiocarbon dates on this tree. So we ran ring 0, the innermost tree ring, ring number 290, ring 300, 310, 320, and then 340 and 354, the outside. And we basically create our own little wiggle based on those radiocarbon dates. So here are those colors. This is that innermost date. Here's that outermost date. So again, if we only had the one date, we would not be able to tell if it was from right here, the 1600s, or from here, the 1700s. But by running these other middle dates, we're actually able to tell that the outermost tree ring here is between 1766 and 1796. And then tree ring dating, matching up the pattern of tree rings that I measured in this dugout canoe to a known established chronology for the area, tells us that the first year that we're looking at is the year 1398. The tree rings get harder to see toward the outside, so that's why we're not like quite as certain about the outside. That's one limitation of doing this kind of work, where you can't sand down an artifact to see those tree rings super well, and you can't take a core. You have to sort of go with what visibility limits you to. But we're looking at a few other possibilities for narrowing this down a little bit more. Right now, we think that based on how much sapwood is present in those trees that I dug up from the Altamaha, we think that this tree was probably cut down between the early to late 1800s, probably like 1830 to 1890. So that's probably when it was constructed. And we're also expanding this work up here to Kentucky, where I am right now. We're looking at this trough. This is this huge wooden trough that the Webb Museum that I work at has had in its collections for quite a while. And it has this really interesting oral history attached to it. So supposedly it was a souvenir that was taken by a guy, and he stuck it in his barn for a long time. And then the barn kind of collapsed around it, and it ended up coming over here to the museum. But the National Park Service wants to know if it's from Mammoth Cave before they take it back to Mammoth Cave and put it on display there. So this would have been used as part of a system of saltpeter mining in Mammoth Cave in the early 1800s. Probably around 70 people were enslaved within Mammoth Cave who were mining the soil in there, and they were processing that to make a component of gunpowder that was used in this the War of 1812 a lot. And this is actually one of the major sites in the U.S. where gunpowder was being created. And so this elaborate wooden system that was created to mix the calcium nitrate, the saltpeter, with water and take it out of the cave would have been used and possibly constructed by these people who were enslaved at this time period. So figuring out whether this artifact is connected with this period helps us use heritage sciences and archaeology to help tell the stories of underrepresented people today. So what we're doing with this, we're figuring out using this radiocarbon wiggle matching paired with dendrochronology, when was this trough made? We actually do have the outer ring of this trough, so we can figure out exactly what year this tree was cut down. So hopefully it'll be early 1800s to 1815. Dendrochronology can also tell us where this tree grew, because the pattern of the rings will match the known chronology from the area where it grew. So I'm comparing that pattern of rings to a bunch of different chronologies around the state and the region to make sure that it matches the one from near Mammoth Cave the best. And then we're also using this scanning electron microscopy, energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy to look at these crystals on this trough. You can see on the right here, there's these little shiny kind of white bits on the trough, which is probably calcium nitrate, that stuff that was being mined in the cave. And there's actually some like crystal blooms on the inside. So my colleague who runs the SEM EDS, we're gonna give her a sample of that, and we can get scanning electron microscope image, which will show us the crystal structure. And then we can also figure out the composition of those crystals. And that'll verify that it was used in a saltpeter mining operation. Over here on the left is an image of the saltpeter mining operation. It's still preserved pretty well in the cave today. So Carla Haddon came up on Monday this week, and we took samples for radiocarbon dating. So with this tree, I did have to sand down this line of it and another line on the outside here to be able to see those tree rings well enough to count and measure them. And you can see how on the bottom right here, those tree rings are pretty visible. This one is a tulip poplar, so they're not quite as visible as they are on the cypress trees that I was working with previously. But again, we took one date from one sample from every 10th ring here. And Carla's going to run those with radiocarbon dating, and we'll see then how old it is. And then after that, I'm going to do the tree ring dating on it. So here we are sampling it on Monday here. So there's a whole bunch of these possibilities. We're hoping to extend this line of research. This radiocarbon wiggle match dating has been done in Europe, but it's almost never been done in North America. And it's never been done on watercraft or on components of archaeological materials that are related to enslavement. So these are sort of two new ways to use these techniques to look at different types of artifacts than we've ever looked at before. So we're pretty excited. We're hoping to collaborate with Mammoth Cave National Park, who's really excited about this research too. And if we can prove with some degree of certainty that this trough is from Mammoth Cave, they're interested in working with us on an exhibit showing how archaeological and heritage sciences can help illuminate the stories of people whose stories haven't been told very much. Yeah.
Well, that was very exciting stuff.
It is, yeah. So that's very ongoing work right now, and I'm pretty enthused about that. And you guys in Florida have tons of great canoes down there too, that have been dated. So all of those represent really good possibilities for trying out this method on too, because it's really neat to figure out different techniques that can help us learn more about the ancient past and about how people interacted with the environment.
Absolutely. Well, I didn't see any more questions coming in, so I think we'll call it a night. And I just wanted to say thank you again for speaking to us. It was absolutely amazing work, and I'm sure everyone really liked it. There's a lot of nice compliments in the chat. Well,
thank you all so much for having me. And if you have more questions later, Jamie's got my email. Feel free to email me, and I'm happy to talk about it. Or yeah, if you are interested in this work, or you have a student who might be interested in it, I'm happy to speak to you about opportunities that might be available for them too. So thank you all so much for having me again.
Thank you.